This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 14 hours GMT on Friday the 26th of January. I'm Claire McDonnell with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, President Trump has told the World Economic Forum in Davos that the world is witnessing the resurgence of a strong and prosperous America that will restore integrity to the international trading system.
I'm here to deliver a simple message. There has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, and to grow in the United States. America is open for business, and we are competitive once again.
Also in the podcast, dozens of migrants have drowned off the coast of Yemen in an overcrowded boat that capsized heading for Africa. China has announced ambitious plans to extend its influence into the Arctic. And later, the mountaineering world pays tribute to the female chronicler of the Himalayas.
I just admired her as a very knowledgeable and very sharp person who knew everything about Himalayan climbing.
But first, President Trump has addressed the World Economic Forum in Davos. He told the meeting that he was there to represent the interests of the American people and to affirm Washington's friendship and partnership in building a better world. Mr. Trump added that America first doesn't mean America alone.
Over the past year, we have made extraordinary strides in the U.S. We're lifting up forgotten communities, creating exciting new opportunities, and helping every American find their path to the American dream, the dream of a great job, a safe home, and a better life for their children. After years of stagnation, the United States is once again experiencing strong economic growth. The stock market is smashing one record after another and has added more than $7 trillion in new wealth since my election. Consumer confidence, business confidence, and manufacturing confidence are the highest they have been in many decades. Since my election, we've created 2.4 million jobs, and that number is going up very, very substantially. The world is witnessing the resurgence of a strong and prosperous America. I'm here to deliver a simple message. There has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, and to grow in the United States. America is open for business, and we are competitive once again.
Well, earlier, Mr. Trump dismissed as fake news reports that he had tried to sack the man heading the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election.
What to fire Robert Mueller.
Fake news, folks. Fake news.
What's your message today?
Typical New York Times fake stories.
According to unnamed officials, Mr. Trump ordered the dismissal of Robert Mueller last June because of what he said were conflicts of interest. President Trump is said to have backed down only when a senior White House lawyer threatened to quit, saying the removal of Mr. Mueller would have catastrophic effects on the presidency. So, a denial from Mr. Trump, but what evidence is there, if any, that he's been trying to derail the investigation? Here's our reporter in Washington, Anthony Zerka.
It's interesting. If I went back and looked at some of his tweets and some of the things that were going on at that time, and that was a point in time Donald Trump was, again, talking about media coverage and complaining about that, but also talking about how the Russian investigation was a witch hunt. There was no collusion between him or his campaign and the Russian government. So if he was contemplating firing Robert Mueller at that time, that could be painted as another piece in efforts by the president and his associates to obstruct the investigation. Now, the fact that he didn't go through with it is noteworthy, but that still could be evidence of his intent or his mental disposition regarding the investigation at that particular time. And honestly, I think it's interesting, too, that these stories are breaking now. I mean, this was, 7 months ago when all of this went down, and we didn't hear about it at the time. And in fact, around that time, Donald Trump's White House aides were saying that Donald Trump never even considered firing Robert Mueller. This coming out now, this gets a lot of people very much aware and conscious of the fact that Donald Trump doesn't like Robert Mueller. So it makes it a little more difficult if Donald Trump tried to fire Robert Mueller now for that to happen. People are prepared. They're kind of woken up. The alarm's been sounded. So, it could be an insulation to help protect Robert Mueller from any further attempts by Donald Trump or Republicans to undermine the investigation.
Anthony Zerka. Meanwhile, here's a sentence you don't hear very often. Donald Trump has apologised. The US president was put on the spot in a BBC TV interview about his decision last year to retweet 3 videos by the deputy leader of the anti-Muslim far-right group Britain First. That caused an uproar in the UK. In an interview broadcast today, the ITV journalist Piers pushed the president to condemn the tweets.
I don't want to cause any difficulty for your country, that I can tell you.
And, can I get an apology out of you just for the retweets of Britain?
Well, if you're telling me,
I think it would go a long way.
Then here's what's fair. If you're telling me there's a horrible people, horrible racist people, I would certainly apologize if you'd like me to do that. I know nothing about them.
And you would disavow yourself of people like that?
I don't want to be involved with people, but you're telling me about these people because I know nothing about these people.
Well, the BBC's James Copnell told me more about the videos the president had tweeted.
Yeah, so he retweeted them back in November, and all 3 supposedly show Muslims acting in a violent way. So one, which it's thought was filmed in Syria, shows a man smashing a statue of the Virgin Mary. Another was shared with the title, Islamist mob pushes a teenage boy off roof and beats him to death. Now, this was footage of a case that's actually relatively well known in Egypt. It was supporters and opponents of the ousted President Mohamed Morsi clashing. And after the events that were filmed, one man who was shown in the video was subsequently hanged for his part in the murder, having been found guilty of the murder. And the final video is called Muslim Migrant Beats Up Dutch Boy on Crutches. However, the Dutch Public Prosecution Service told the BBC that the man involved was not a migrant. He was a Dutch citizen born and raised in the country. And on top of that, the attacker's religion is not even known.
So will this statement that he is prepared to apologise, even though he says he didn't know anything about the people who tweeted these fake videos, is that going to be enough to satisfy his critics?
Well, as you said, it's fairly unusual for him to apologise, and he is clearly on something of a charm offensive towards the UK. He said he loved the country, and in particular Scotland. He said he had a very, very good relationship with the Prime Minister, Theresa May. And as you say, he said he didn't know anything about this group involved. However, some were already reacting to his interview, saying that it was a bit mealy-mouthed, perhaps, as an apology. He was prepared to apologise rather than actually saying, I'm sorry. And I think more substantively, many people who dislike the retweets dislike what they saw as anti-Muslim sentiment behind them. And Trump was not saying sorry for that. He said he was against Muslim extremism in the video, but he didn't say at any point Muslims are making great contributions to our society or public life in the UK or US. So I think many will still be unhappy.
James Copnell. Now to other news. The British Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson has said Russia could cause thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths in the UK by crippling vital infrastructure. He told a British newspaper that Moscow was spying on energy supplies, which, if cut, could cause total chaos in the country. Brian Lord is a former Deputy Director for Intelligence and Cyber Operations at GCHQ, that's Britain's intelligence agency. Celia Hatton asked him how serious a threat is Russia.
I mean, I think, first of all, we have to look at these comments all coming within the sort of window of a debate on defence spending. But it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're actually saying is invalid. I think what they are trying to say is the very nature of the threat, and therefore, as a consequence, the very nature of national defence is shifting. We are operating in a time of sort of less traditional defence threat. Doesn't mean to say that national defence is any safer. I think what we've got to recognise around this, that fundamentally the world in which we live and how we operate, and therefore all our dependencies have changed. And so, therefore, as a consequence, our vulnerabilities to adversarial activity have also changed and shifted. And I think what the Defence Secretary is saying, he is not sure that defence, his area of responsibility, is necessarily quite ready for that, and we shouldn't take our eye off the ball in how to adjust and adapt.
OK, can you walk us through this threat as it's being painted by the Defence Secretary?
Of course. So I think what the Defence Secretary is saying is that the dependencies on our life have changed. What is happening is any state, in this case Russia, has to learn and has to understand the vulnerabilities of its adversary, in this case the UK. So because the nature of how it can attack and how it can exploit our vulnerabilities are now far wider than they ever have been, whether that's through online activity or for more subversive measures, the Russians are spending a lot of time really understanding our infrastructure so that at a point of their choosing, they can disrupt to a greater or lesser extent the public services. The reason I think that Russia has been highlighted perhaps more than other adversarial states, because it is not just the Russians that are doing this, is the Russians are proving increasingly adept at exploiting what he called that grey seam between peace and war. So in other words, this kind of pressure can be applied far earlier on in state-on-state conflict than perhaps more traditional military means. And so there are a number of tools at the Russians' disposal to, in this case, as the Defence Secretary is saying, to how do we disrupt energy supplies. In order to understand how they disrupt energy supplies at a point of their choosing, they have to understand how our system works. And that's the kind of intelligence gathering that we're seeing from the Russians in order to configure their capability. And we need to worry about that. We need to worry about it because this is the nature of attack, this is the nature of threat and warfare that is not going to go away.
So it seems that our points of weakness have changed. We're talking about undersea connections, connecting our electricity, linking us to the continent, and other undersea connections that deliver gas to the UK. Our points of weakness have changed. Therefore, they're arguing our points of defence must change. Is this possible? How much money, how many resources would this take?
There you've hit the crux of the matter, because this is inevitably shaped around the debate of defence spending. And I think it is going to take a significant number of resources, because we can't just stop while we rebuild defence in the 21st century. We have to evolve from what we have now to where we have to go. And actually, therefore, the investment and spending in those kind of areas has to be significant, because you cannot move from one state of affairs to another without investing significantly.
We do have to point out that there's a difference between capability and intent. Is it not somewhat irresponsible for the Defence Minister to make front page news in the UK warning of thousands of deaths simply because Russia might have the capability to attack these weak points? Doesn't mean that it's going to do so tomorrow.
Does it mean that it's going to do so tomorrow? Probably not. However, what I expect to see, and what I really expect to see, is as the Russians and others develop this capability, they, like any other nation, are going to start testing them out and trying them out and what works and what doesn't work. And so what I do expect to see is disruption of services while the Russians and others are working out, does this work, does this not work? Because they have to be sure what they are trying to do is going to work.
Brian Lord there, former official at GCHQ, Britain's intelligence agency. At least 30 African migrants have drowned off the coast of Yemen this week on an overcrowded boat operated by smugglers. The UN says there were more than 150 Somalis and Ethiopians on the boat, which was travelling from Yemen towards Djibouti. Our Arab Affairs editor Sebastian Usher gave us more details.
What we heard from the UN, from the Agency for Migrations, is that a boat left the southern coast of Yemen on the 23rd, 3 days ago of January, and that it was overcrowded. More than 150 people from Ethiopia and from Somalia were aboard it, going back to Djibouti, smugglers taking it, and it capsized, as has happened before. It's a dangerous, though short crossing. But also survivors said that the smugglers had opened fire on them as the boat was sinking. Now, we don't have more details about whether this was because the smugglers had seen that there were official boats that were coming towards them and they were trying, as they've done before, to get rid of the evidence, essentially, which is the people that they were smuggling. I mean, it's a horrific thing, but it's not the first time. There are at least 2 incidents like this that happened towards the end of last year, in which, again, large numbers of people died. So this is a very disturbing incident. It's one that is happening more and more frequently because the numbers of people actually coming the other direction from East Africa to Yemen has grown considerably in the last few years, which seems counterintuitive. You think Yemen is plunged in a terrible war. Why would anybody go there? But the smugglers tell them that essentially once they get to Yemen, Other smugglers can take them through to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to the United Arab Emirates, where they will be able to find work. Many of them never get there, of course. But this is a much cheaper alternative than going the European, the Mediterranean route. This can cost just $100, the crossing. The problem is not just it's dangerous, but also much more is demanded when they're on the boat. Again, survivors say that the smugglers try to extort more money from them while they're on the boat, when they're at the mercy of the smugglers. So it's a wake-up call, the UN is saying, to what's happening. More than 90,000 people made the crossing from East Africa to Yemen last year, and more people are going the other way because they're finding that they can't get through because of the war, that the promises they've been given by smugglers are essentially lies. And also Saudi Arabia has cracked down hugely on foreign workers in the country. Many have been told to leave. So some have been deported, some are just crossing the border and trying to get out themselves.
Sebastian Usher. Now, as we heard in the previous podcast, the BBC's Shaima Khalil has been to Mosul, Iraq's second city, to see how life has changed for the people there after IS militants left it in ruins. It's not just the infrastructure that needs rebuilding, but also the lives of the residents there. As Shaima now reports, in the east of the city, the hustle and bustle of the streets is in full force, with one very noticeable difference.
There are many sounds the people of Mosul have grown used to. Gunfire, mortars, the shouts of fighters on the streets, the screams of residents here crying out for help. But there's one sound you definitely wouldn't have heard in Mosul in the past 3 years. It's this. Yunus market area is a vibrant part of eastern Mosul. The mosque after which this area is named, Nabi Yunus, is on a hilltop overlooking the whole city, and it's been destroyed in the battle to rid IS militants. There's twisted metal sticking out of different corners of the mosque, and the actual arches of the entrance have also been destroyed. But to my left, there are a group of workers who are actually working on reconstructing it bit by bit. It's going to take a while to rebuild this mosque, but also to rebuild the city. I'm here to meet Amin Maqdad, a musician who wants to reconstruct his city in a different way. So, Amin, we're on top of a hill overlooking Mosul with a panoramic view of the city. Can you point out your neighborhood for me?
Yeah, my neighborhood, a Salam neighborhood. It's like the end of the city. So there's too many places, could be having many kind of ISIS.
And there's been a lot of talk about neighborhoods like yours in Mosul, where in the same building, for example, you find people and their neighbors have become IS militants. Was that then the same for your home, for example, your building?
A lot of them. There's ISIS ideology in the community. So I teach 3 students while ISIS in Mosul. They started to be a musician when ISIS came to Mosul. One of them wanted to be involved with ISIS, and he came to ask me, should I involved with ISIS? But I said, let me play some music to you. So I just play some music, and he said, oh, that's beautiful. I said, you want to be a musician? He said, could I? Even I don't know how to write or read.
I understand that when IS militants came and took over your neighborhood, you went to the roof of your house.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, it was on the second day of when they came. I was so angry, and I take my cello and put it on the roof with a chair and played AC/DC piece.
AC/DC.
It was a thunderstruck, but I named it as an Angry Hope.
So here you were on the roof of your house playing AC/DC on the cello, and the IS militants were doing what? Saying what?
They say, oh, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And all my friends, they came and advised me, oh, you will get killed. You should stop the music. I said, okay, if I just stop the music, I will never live. So ISIS, they took all my instruments and they said that I'm a curse of devil and they will punish me. And so I escaped From my home to my uncle's home, it's 10 minutes from my neighborhood.
And now you're back in Mosul and you want to start an orchestra in your city. Tell me about that.
We want to start a music academy first because we need to make a musical community. Because in the first minutes when ISIS, they left my home and take all my instruments, I just promised myself I will destroy you.
Shaima Khalil there on the musicians breathing life back into eastern Mosul. You are listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. If you've missed any of the week's main events and wish to catch up, then why not listen to The World This Week? This week, they focus on the world's elite who are meeting in Davos, a more upbeat scene there than usual, amid forecasts of widespread global growth. Then to Myanmar, where human rights comes under renewed scrutiny. And also in the programme, our media editor asks, is Facebook on the decline? That's all in The World This Week, broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays and available to download from our website, www.bbc.co.uk/programmes. Now, 250,000 South Sudanese children are at risk of dying if urgent food aid is not delivered to them. This is a warning from the UN children's agency UNICEF. Its executive director, Henrietta Fore, has been to the troubled country where she told the BBC that there was a very real threat of famine. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since fighting broke out in the young nation in 2013, and a peace deal signed 2 years later has been violated repeatedly. Our correspondent Anne Soy begins her report in the capital, Juba.
The mark is 11.22.
What does it mean?
It means the child is severely malnourished.
That's the measurement around Christine Jackson's upper arm. She weighs half as much as she should at 22 months of age, but she's now receiving life-saving treatment at the Al Sabah Children's Hospital in Juba. Her father, Jackson Lepita, is taking care of her.
For me, it is very difficult to bring us very good items to give Christians.
This is a country that has gone through high inflation, coupled with the fact that it is a country at war. And so life is very difficult for many people here, even for Christine's father, who is working, putting food on the table, a balanced diet for his children is a struggle. It is estimated that 1 in every 10 children in Juba is malnourished. Outside the capital, the situation is worse. I join a UN team on a trip to a rebel-controlled area north of the capital. South Sudan's poor infrastructure and a 4-year civil war have forced humanitarian organizations to rely on air transport. Easily thousands of people are gathered here at the Ganiel Food Distribution Center, most of them women and children. Some have walked from far to come for their rations of food. A World Food Programme plane arrives, and from its belly, bales of food with orange parachutes drop onto the field nearby, about 100 meters from where we are standing.
He went out to look for these 2 children, and then he was killed while looking for the children.
That's UNICEF's executive director, Henrietta Fore, meeting some of the beneficiaries of aid. She says the situation in the country is dire.
It is now on a threat of the famine here in South Sudan. We know the answers on how to help the people. So the key is to get humanitarian access to the sites, but also to get immediate funding. With that, we think that we can save the lives of thousands. At stake are about 250,000 children and their lives now in the dry season. So if we can save them, that would be a great gift for the world.
With no end in sight to the fighting, donors will be forced to continue feeding not only the displaced, but also those living in their homes but are unable to farm. And the generation born since independence more than 6 years ago is the biggest loser. Severely malnourished children never fully recover, that is, if they live to adulthood.
And Soy in South Sudan. China has announced ambitious plans to develop shipping lanes through the Arctic in what it called a polar silk route. Beijing said global warming meant shipping routes through the Arctic would become increasingly important for international trade. Warren Poole reports.
China's President Xi Jinping has already begun transforming Chinese land and sea connections with its global markets in Asia and beyond. But this is the first time Beijing has outlined in detail its ambitions for the Arctic, where global warming has opened up the prospect of a much quicker voyage to Europe for standard cargo ships. China says it will encourage businesses to build infrastructure and conduct commercial trial voyages in the Arctic. Its Vice Foreign Minister, Kong Xuanyu, says Beijing wants to cooperate with Arctic nations. He dismissed suggestions that China wanted to plunder Arctic resources.
Now to France, where there has been widespread unrest in some supermarkets. Here's one such fracas in a shop in central France. The motivation? Well, if you can believe it, a 70% discount on a popular chocolate spread called Nutella. So what exactly is it about that bargain that makes consumers behave in that way? Celia Hatton spoke to Ben Voyer, a consumer psychologist and visiting lecturer at the London School of Economics. So was he surprised about this retail rage over a jar of Nutella?
No, not at all. I think we've got all the recipe for these kind of things. We've got a famous brand and a product that has a cult status in France, like Nutella. And then we have the bargain, the 70% off, that stimulates consumers' kind of fight or flight reaction. They just have to go for it. So these two combined is the recipe for the Nutella riots. We've seen that before with Black Friday sales in the US, for instance.
We've seen it before with Black Friday sales, but usually it seems it's over much more expensive items like big screen TVs. It does seem to shock that this is over a food product, which really, in the scheme of things, isn't very expensive.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think in a way it is because Nutella has such a cult status in France and is favoured of families. I think it also points out to the fact that, for many families, this is an essential, in a way, product as part of their family lives. And so, getting that discount and being able to make their family happy is something that, that probably affects this. But there is another reason behind that, is that, in a way, for consumers, it almost becomes a game. As, consumers these days are bargain hunters, and they're there to hunt for the best bargain. And so when they see that kind of, 70% off Nutella, they just go for it, and it becomes a game.
Ben Voyer there, a consumer psychologist. Now, one of the space industry's most reliable rockets, the Ariane 5, suffered a fault during a launch that left scientists waiting for 2 hours to find out whether its mission has succeeded. 9 minutes after it blasted off from French Guiana, carrying 2 satellites, all radio contact was lost. Here's our science correspondent, Jonathan Amos.
The Ariane 5 is the workhorse of European rocketry and puts up about half of all the big telecom satellites which relay phone calls, television feeds and internet links around the globe. Before this latest mission, it had set a benchmark for reliability, 82 successive flights without mishap. But controllers suspected something might be wrong this time, when communication from the vehicle was lost just as its upper stage ignited to make the final push for orbit. Everyone was left completely in the dark. It turned out, though, that the rocket was continuing to do its job, flying ever higher into the sky. The 2 satellites on board, including one made by Airbus UK, were eventually dropped off above the Earth, where they were then able to establish contact of their own with the ground.
Now, if you want to get fresh ideas about something, it helps to change perspective. Someone who's done just that is the French astronaut Thomas Pesquet. He's in the UK to talk about his experience of living for several months on the International Space Station. My colleague Sarah Montague asked him how heading out into space quite literally changed the way he saw the world.
Yeah, I think it did, as a matter of fact. And this is what you call a life-changing experience in so many different ways. First of all, I think, to me, by looking at the planet Earth from Earth's orbit, you see how fragile it is, and we take it for granted here when we're on the ground. But when you see the negative effect of human activity, the effects of climate change from the space station, whether it be water pollution, sea and rivers, clearings, cuts in the Amazonian forests, air pollution, the ice melting in the glaciers in South America, you start to reflect and you think that this planet is very fragile. We have to protect it.
So what, were you shocked by that when you saw it?
I was. So initially when you see the Earth you're struck by how beautiful it is. And that's really what overwhelms you at the beginning. And then you start looking at the details, and you start seeing the not so nice areas, the areas where the human activity is affecting the environment. And across all along this 6 months mission, I started taking pictures more and more of those areas at the end of the mission because that's what shocked me towards the end.
Mm-hmm. Now, the space station is, of course, an international collaboration.
It is.
And this is sort of what you were talking about as well last night, that idea of countries working together.
Yeah, absolutely. We try to inspire young people and to, make them try to reach their goals. That's what it was all about. And yeah, the International Space Station is international by essence. And I think that's one of the best examples of how you can achieve together things that you wouldn't be able to achieve just as one country. No country on Earth could have built the space station as it is today on their own, whether it be the US, Russia, or any single country in Europe. Just by putting our resources together and working together, we were able to just build this incredible engineering feat.
And you're hoping to go back soon?
Oh, yeah, we're all hoping to, space is addictive. Once you've flown in space, it's like having superpowers. You can fly around, you can float, you can carry really, really heavy stuff with just 2 fingers. So it's like being a superhero. Everybody wants to go back and to claim their superpowers back.
The superhero back on Earth, French astronaut Thomas Pesquet. An American journalist who chronicled the successful ascents of Mount Everest and other Himalayan peaks for decades has died at the age of 94. Elizabeth Hawley was a leading authority on the world's highest mountain, despite never having reached its base camp. Our South Asia editor, Jill McGivering, reports.
Elizabeth Hawley came to Nepal as a journalist 60 years ago. Her first big story was the successful American attempt on Mount Everest in 1963. She herself never climbed, but over the decade she became a leading authority on expeditions and founded the Himalayan Database, a meticulous record of ascents. She was also seen as a key person to authenticate climbs. Her name will survive her. A mountain in northwest Nepal is named Peak Hawley in her honour.
Jill McGivering. And that is all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. But just before we go, we'd like to tell you that we will be in Washington next week for President Trump's first State of the Union address. We'll be doing a special podcast, so are you currently listening in Washington? If so, and you would like to take part, then email us. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Claire McDonnell, and until next time, goodbye.